Chapter 9. The Flood as a Genetic Reset. By the time of Noah, the earth was no longer the world Adam had walked. The line between human and something else had blurred. The Book of Enoch, preserved in full in Ethiopia, describes it plainly. The Nephilim had filled the land, devouring its resources, enslaving its people, and spilling innocent blood until the very soil cried out to heaven. Genesis 6 says, "All flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth." This was not poetic exaggeration. The corruption was not only moral, it was biological. The descendants of the Watchers had intertwined their bloodline with humanity's, distorting the image of God imprinted in man from the beginning. The seed through which the Messiah would come was under siege, not just by sin, but by alteration. God's judgment in the form of the flood was not an act of random wrath. It was a surgical strike. It was both a cleansing of the earth's wickedness and what could be called a genetic reset. Humanity's original design, as God had made it, had to be preserved for the promise in Eden to remain possible. Here enters Noah. Scripture tells us Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations. The Hebrew phrase, perfect in his generations, tamim, refers not just to moral integrity, but to physical wholeness, untainted lineage. In other words, Noah's family had not been corrupted by the hybridization of the Nephilim. This is why he was chosen, not because he was flawless in behavior, but because his line remained a pure vessel for the covenant yet to come. The Ethiopian tradition adds that Noah's righteousness was visible in his refusal to participate in the feasts, violence, and sorcery of the age. While others pursued the wisdom taught by the Watchers, Noah clung to the ancient instructions handed down from Adam through Seth. He built altars, he offered sacrifices to God alone, and he kept himself apart from the alliances that brought ruin to others. When the decree of the flood came, it was not merely a warning of disaster, it was the last invitation to turn back. Noah preached for decades while constructing the ark, his very labor a testimony to the coming judgment. But the people mocked. Why believe in a God you cannot see when you can build cities with your own hands and master the secrets of heaven through forbidden knowledge? Then the skies opened. The fountains of the deep broke apart. Rain fell in sheets the earth had never known. The waters rose, swallowing fields, cities, and fortresses. Giants fell beneath the waves. The sound of the Nephilim's strength, the roar of their armies, was silenced under the crushing flood. It is here the wave peak speaks. Judgment was mercy for the human race. If God had allowed the corruption to continue unchecked, there would have been no untainted humanity left, no vessel for the Messiah, no fulfillment of the promise made to Eve. The flood was not only an end, it was a beginning. From the ark, a new chapter of humanity emerged, but the memory of the Watchers did not die in the water. Their spirits, according to Enoch, became the wandering entities the Bible calls unclean spirits, restless, bodiless, still seeking to influence mankind. The world was cleansed, but the war was far from over. And so Noah's survival was more than a rescue. It was a preservation of the covenant line, a divine intervention to safeguard the future. Every rainbow since has been a reminder that God's judgment and mercy often walk hand in hand, and that sometimes, to save the future, He must end the present. But the story does not stop on the mountains of Ararat. Far away in the highlands of Ethiopia, a people would become the guardians of this ancient memory, holding not only the story of the flood, but the very books that explain why it had to happen. And those guardians still keep watch today, in monasteries carved from stone, where the word and the warning are bound together for the last days. Chapter 10. Ethiopia. Guardians of the prophetic memory. Long after the waters of the flood receded, after Noah's sons spread across the continents and nations rose and fell, there remained a thread of preservation, an unbroken line of guardianship that would find its home in the highlands of Ethiopia. While empires in the west shifted their borders and rewrote their histories, Ethiopia remained a fortress, both in geography and in faith. Its mountains, rising like ancient sentinels, shielded a people who did not merely read the scriptures, they lived them, and in their hands were manuscripts the rest of the world had lost. For millennia, Ethiopian monks have lived in monasteries carved from sheer rock, high above the valleys, where time seems to move slower. These are not the ornate cathedrals of Europe, but sanctuaries of stone, hewn by hand, hidden from invaders and consecrated for one purpose, to guard the testimony entrusted to them. Among their treasures are two works the Western canon abandoned, the Book of Enoch and the Book of Adam and Eve. To the Ethiopian Church, these are not curiosities or secondary writings. They are integral parts of the sacred record. Where the West saw them as dangerous or unnecessary, Ethiopia saw them as vital warnings for the generations living in the shadow of the last days. The monks do not preserve these texts out of mere tradition. They believe them to be prophetic in nature, blueprints for recognizing the spiritual patterns that repeat in human history. The rebellion of the Watchers, the corruption before the flood, the exile of Adam and Eve. These are not stories locked in the ancient past. They are templates of how the enemy works, how humanity falls, and how God intervenes. For centuries, foreign powers tried to take these manuscripts. Some came with armies, others with gold, others under the guise of scholarship. But the guardians were not easily deceived. Manuscripts were hidden in underground chambers, sealed in stone libraries, where only the trusted could enter. In some cases, the monks memorized entire books so that even if the parchment was destroyed, the word would not perish. It is here the wave peak speaks. When the West forgot, Ethiopia remembered. While Western Christianity gradually lost the context of Genesis, stripping away the layers that explain the war after Eden, Ethiopia kept the full narrative alive. When the West debated whether Enoch was allegory or myth, Ethiopia kept reading it as prophecy. And when the story of Adam and Eve ended at Eden's gate in Western pulpits, Ethiopian believers continued the journey into the cave of treasures, learning how to fight the same enemy. This is why Ethiopia has often been targeted, not only politically, but spiritually. If you can silence the guardians, you can cut off access to the very warnings that could awaken the world. But to this day, the ancient church stands. Its priests in white robes, chanting the same words sung for centuries, holding manuscripts that smell of myrrh and thyme. Prophetically, the preservation of these books in Ethiopia carries a message for the modern believer. Truth may be suppressed, but God always raises up a remnant to keep it alive. The question is never whether the truth exists, it is whether we will seek it. And as the shadows of our own age grow darker, with the return of forbidden knowledge, the rise of global systems of control, and the erosion of spiritual identity, these Ethiopian manuscripts read less like history and more like headlines. They are not simply relics. They are roadmaps, pointing from the first war in Eden to the final battle in Revelation. From their mountain sanctuaries, the guardians still whisper the same warning. The patterns are returning. The days of Noah are not behind us. They are before us. And in that return lies the next great test of humanity, which is why the spirit of the Watchers has found new forms in our own time.